So now it's time for my 20,000 subscriber thanks video, and as usual, I'm answering questions you've asked me. What fascinates you the most about history? I would have to say it's the detective work of the research necessary to identify the facts. It's really time-consuming and energy-intensive to identify the relevant secondary and tertiary sources, verify their accuracy, locate and assess primary sources when necessary, and synthesize all the sources, but I do enjoy the process. It's very satisfying when you finally arrive at reliable results. What made you decide to start a YouTube channel? That too, specifically on checking other history YouTubers and general history information. It started when I became frustrated with the amount of junk science and fake history shared on Facebook. I originally started a Facebook page, later created a Medium account, and eventually migrated to YouTube when I decided it had better reach and I could present the facts in a more engaging way, audiovisually. I also started looking critically at the history channels which were already popular on YouTube and noticing that so few of them actually cited any sources. As a result, I started fact-checking some of them and was pretty surprised to find out how often they were wrong. Afterwards, I went to Reddit and found subreddits with professional historians, such as Ask Historians, which had a very low opinion of most history YouTube channels, and for very good reason. Consequently, I decided to try and lift the bar for quality in history YouTube. How does your channel challenge the notion of most of history YouTube being non-academic? I don't think it really does, actually. Most of history YouTube is non-academic in the sense that most history YouTubers don't have academic qualifications in history, nor are they professional scholars. That is, a person holding an academic position in an institution of higher learning, nor do they use academic research methods when creating their content, especially academic historiographical methods. I have no relevant academic qualifications in history, and I am not a professional scholar. I do use academic research methods and apply academic historiographical methods, and I've converted a couple of my video scripts into either academic conference presentations or scholarly journal articles. So I could say my channel takes an academic approach, which is rare in history YouTube, and from that perspective, I'd call mine an academic channel, but I wouldn't call my videos academic works. In contrast, Dr. Justin Sledge's Esoterica channel has content which I would consider genuinely academic. Why are you an anarcho-mutualist instead of, for example, anarcho-communist? It's mainly due to personal experience with anarcho-mutualism thought and praxis in my early life, but also experiences with it later in life. I think it's more practical than anarcho-communism. See the link in the video description for a playlist on my secondary channel which describes various anarchist systems, which might help. How do you, as an anarchist, look at countries like India? Like I do at any other nation. As an anarchist, I'm opposed to nation states, so I oppose the Indian state as such on that basis. I don't have a personal opinion on India as a nation beyond that. Your opinion of current and 1800s, 1900s missionary work. How do you plan to contribute to the Great Commission? Your position on Christology. Your criticisms of the current state of biblical scholarship. 3 main criticisms that come to mind I have heard from people with related degrees are: the field is too biased and should be scrapped, the field is full of people without philosophical rigor making basic mistakes and are emotionally attached to their arguments, and a lot of the more popular and as such more influential to the public scholars make bad arguments that are essentially begging for the answer they want. That's a lot to answer, and I apologize for being fairly brief, since answering these questions in depth would take a solid hour by itself. As for my opinion on Christian missionary work in the last 2.5 centuries, my view differs greatly according to who the missionaries were, where they were, and what they did. In some cases, they proved extremely beneficial to indigenous people, whereas in some places, they were utterly destructive. In Taiwan, the indigenous people treated them skeptically, but many were converted by the benefits brought by missionary work, such as access to free and effective medicine, as opposed to paying for medicine from a local shaman whose treatments were typically ineffective, access to hospitals, the recording of their language and cultural traditions with writing systems invented by the missionaries and taught to the indigenous people, and the fact that Christian religious teachings, and in particular Christian morals, were far more harmonious with indigenous beliefs than the religions and culture of the Chinese colonizers, who not only exploited the indigenous people, but were regarded by them as very immoral. How do I plan to contribute to the Great Commission? I've preached the gospel to people interested in listening. My position on Christology? Unitarian Christology. That is, there is one God who is one person, the Father. Jesus is God's human Son, and the Holy Spirit is God's impersonal power. Criticism of the current state of biblical scholarship? Well, I'd agree with all 3 points that your friend raised, and I would say generally, apart from the higher level academic scholarship, there is not enough critical thought and too much prior commitment to traditional theology. So yeah, that's a short answer. I'm sorry it couldn't be longer. What is the historical period or figure that fascinates you the most? I'll answer that in terms of a period, and it's definitely the 20th century. It saw an absolutely exponential rise in human knowledge, technology, and achievement, while also seeing the most bloody and destructive human conflicts in the entire history of our species. It's also a lot easier to study than other periods, given the close proximity of the sources, their sheer number, and their quality. How did your study of history impact your view of religion? Do you see it more positively or negatively? As a follow-up to this question, do you believe that there is a trans-historical essence to religion, or that it is an invented modern category? My study of history has made me see religion critically, not necessarily more negatively or positively than before, but critically. I do think religion can have strong positive outcomes, which is possibly why it has been such a widespread feature of human society. Yes, I believe religion is trans-historical. As far as I know, humans have apparently had something definable as a religious experience for pretty much as long as we've been human, and it may even be an intrinsic part of the human experience. Will you ever do videos covering political theory? I already do on my secondary channel, Academic Anarchist, although it's mainly anarchist theory. It's more like personal curiousness. I know you had a bad time with it from your German ancestry, but what is your thought about nationalism, and is it reconcilable with anarchist thought as a whole? I am fundamentally opposed to nationalism and regard it as irreconcilable with anarchism. Some Indigenous groups see it as a path to success, while other Indigenous groups, such as the Aboriginal Australians and Taiwan's Aboriginal people, do not. In Western-dominated states, I don't think many of them really want to follow through and actually create their own nation-state. From what I can see, the concept of nationhood was borrowed by some Indigenous groups from Western thought, sometimes surprisingly early, in order to legitimize Indigenous people in Western eyes by using a Western frame of reference rather than an Indigenous frame of reference. Although this was apparently popularized after becoming standard usage in Canada in the 1970s, the view of Aboriginal groups as nations rather than ethnic groups dates back decades further, and I believe it was even used by some of the earlier colonizers. What music do you like, and who is your favorite composer or musician? That is such a difficult question because I have a very eclectic taste in music as a result of being exposed to a wide variety of cross-cultural musical influences by my parents. But I do have a great fondness for Renaissance polyphony, and in particular the works of the Elizabethan composer Thomas Tallis. See the link in the video description to his most famous work, Spem in Alium, a highly complex motet, sometimes cited as the most complex piece of choral music in the entire Renaissance, which was scored for 40 separate parts, requiring 8 groups of 5 choristers, each group singing soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass, and takes around 10 minutes to sing. I think it's the greatest piece of choral music ever composed in Europe in any time or place. I once listened to it on repeat for 9 hours while driving from Melbourne to Adelaide, and I have never tired of it. When it comes to other composers, I also think Bach is the greatest composer of early modern Europe, and I honestly think he probably hasn't been surpassed in Europe even now. I also love Handel and Haydn as choral composers, and Vivaldi's outstanding string pieces. Mozart's music is incomparably dazzling, and I always admire it, but he just doesn't captivate me the way Bach does. I'm not a huge fan of Beethoven, although I do think his Ode to Joy is one of the most beautiful choral pieces ever composed. In terms of modern music, I like traditional jazz and some modern jazz, especially Harry Connick Jr., but I also grew up with 70s era disco, such as the Bee Gees, ABBA, and Boney M, as well as folk rock bands and artists such as Maddie Pryor, Steel Eye Span, and Jethro Tull. Moving to even more modern music, I'm a real fan of ambient and sybient music by groups such as Carbon-Based Lifeforms. I've listened to absolutely hours of that while creating my videos, and I find it fantastic music to work to. Outside Anglo-European musical traditions, I'm a real fan of the Indian sitar composer and player Ravi Shankar, as a result of my family having a couple of his records, and I really like the sound of the sitar as an instrument. I've found quite a bit of sybient music using the sitar, actually, for some reason, maybe because it has that occasionally unearthly resonance. I have a few Mongolian friends and a Mongolian goddaughter through whom I was introduced to Mongolian music, and I love the Mongolian horse fiddle as well as Mongolian folk song, in particular the throat singing, which is also common to the Altai and Tuvan people. See the links in the video description for examples. Finally, as a result of 12 years of volunteer work in Aboriginal communities in Taiwan, I learned Sugulyak Dayen, one of the Aboriginal dialects, as well as a couple of dozen Atayal songs in that dialect, both traditional and modern, and I came to appreciate their musical tradition, which I really enjoy listening to and enjoy singing. Is there a specific reason you do so much work to the point of losing sleep hours? Well, I have a full-time job of 40 to 42 hours a week and a part-time job of 20 to 25 hours a week. So on weekdays, I typically work 12 to 14 hours. This month, I'm also starting 2 government-certified vocational training courses, which are important to my full-time job, so that will take another 9 hours a week. Anything I want to do for myself has to come after those obligations have been met, leaving me very little time remaining in each day. And as a result, I typically have to sacrifice my sleep for my YouTube channel. I was previously considering a PhD and actually discussed this with a professor at Monash University, which is quite close to me and where I studied my master's degree. He was very enthusiastic about my proposal and said he might be able to be my supervisor, but when I realized the vocational training courses were more immediately important to my career, I decided to put the PhD on hold until next year after I've completed those courses. Meanwhile, I'll just keep on doing occasional research for it and writing up my thesis proposal. If you're wondering about the topic, it's a thesis on the development of cyberpunk as a genre, correcting what I see as a misreading of its history based on the research I've conducted for my videos responding to a series of videos on cyberpunk by YouTuber The Cavernacle. See the link in the video description. After I had written 70 pages of script for those videos and collected over 200 sources, I started thinking this was a pretty good foundation for a PhD, and I'd really like to pursue that next year. Since the first Q&A, what was your most changed position? For example, a historical discussion, political issue, or personal belief? Why and how was it changed? I'd say the greatest shift in my views has come as a result of my study of cyberpunk in response to the Cavernacle's videos. I've already mentioned just how influential that was on me. When I initially watched those videos, I had a feeling that he had a reasonable case that he was just overstating, and having read a lot of 90s and post-90s literary analysis of cyberpunk, I knew there was plenty of mainstream scholarly literature making the same arguments as he was, though sometimes with more caveats. However, the more I investigated the history, the more I became convinced that the view of cyberpunk origins which developed in the 90s, and in particular the 90s view of the original 1982 Blade Runner movie, was significantly flawed and based on a misunderstanding of the relevant history. In fact, the extent to which that body of literature made demonstrably untrue statements about the socio-historical context of Blade Runner was the greatest surprise. I have a feeling that a few early to mid-90s papers became particularly influential early on and produced a kind of cottage industry of cyberpunk critique which largely repeated the arguments in those papers rather than attempting to investigate them. I don't think many people really did the work of examining the primary sources, and those who did typically read them through an anachronistic lens. I also think that the development of so-called techno-orientalism, a critical lens through which Western sci-fi, in particular cyberpunk, is critiqued, had a lot to do with misrepresentations of the origins of cyberpunk and the original Blade Runner movie. I'll be commenting on that in one of my later videos in response to the Tabernacle. What are some of the most ridiculous and evidence-less stuff you used to believe? Maybe in the late teens. Well, I'll tell you bluntly, due to fundamentalist Christian influences on my upbringing, during my late teens, I thought the modern theory of evolution was false, and I didn't really shake that until my 20s. That's probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever believed. How do you reconcile your politics and principles with the demands of living under capitalism? To what extent has this been a challenge for you? Well, first of all, I reject the commonly repeated claim that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. I think that is typically implemented either as a defeatist submission to capitalist systems or as a shield against deliberate involvement in capitalism, often self-serving. As an anarchist, I believe in the principles of dual power and prefiguration. Prefiguration means following a lifestyle which is as much as possible like the lifestyle of a realized anarchist community. In practice, this means I attempt to live according to anarchist principles, minimizing my involvement in the capitalist system, which is one of the reasons why I don't monetize my videos or accept sponsorships. Dual power means establishing and or assisting groups and organizations which provide essential social services in parallel with, and typically better than, government and private services. In my case, this has meant volunteer work for social welfare organizations and community organizations. In Taiwan, I was involved for about 15 years in volunteer work in NGOs for marginalized people, including 2 orphanages and an HIV shelter and halfway home for orphans, undocumented migrants, abuse victims, and other marginalized people, as well as for one of Taiwan's largest social welfare organizations. When you haven't yet heard of a specific subject, where is your go-to to find reliable sources that explain the essential information about that subject? I've covered this before in my videos, How do I check a source for accuracy? And How to research and assess scholarly literature. See the links in the video description. I typically start with tertiary literature such as specialist encyclopedias, dictionaries, and handbooks, but I also consult literature reviews in scholarly journal articles. I find Google Scholar useful for this purpose, as well as university department bibliographies. Favorite films, history-related or otherwise? One of my all-time favorite movies is Stanley Kubrick's 1968 movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It has incredible cinematography, and the obsessively detailed sets and devotion to realism have ensured it still looks visually amazing today, certainly able to stand with modern productions. This is even more impressive when you consider it was produced before people landed on the moon. Also on my list are Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 movie Stalker, a cinematic interpretation of Arkady and Boris Strugatsky's 1972 novel Roadside Picnic. The Ukrainian Stalker video game franchise was based on this movie. I also have a strong fondness for Ridley Scott's 1982 movie Blade Runner, although I think it's a movie contemporary viewers find hard to appreciate. Although I saw the first Star Wars movie when it was originally released in Australia, and later saw both The Empire Strikes Back and The Last Jedi on release, I was never a real member of the fan base. I just thought they were interesting and different. I developed a real liking for sci-fi in my childhood, mainly as a result of my father's influence, and I read a lot of Silver Age sci-fi. Not just the popular favorites like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Harry Harrison, and Frank Herbert, but also some of the critically acclaimed but I think less appreciated authors such as Keith Laumer and Clifford Simak. Getting back to the subject of Star Wars, out of the entire cinematic corpus, I regard Empire Strikes Back and Rogue One as the very best of the franchise by a very long margin, and I see them as very similar films. Some of my favorite movies include Guillermo del Toro's 2008 movie Pan's Labyrinth, Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049 and his first 2 Dune movies, and Christopher Nolan's Inception, The Prestige, Interstellar, and Tenet. Kubrick, Del Toro, Villeneuve, and Nolan are probably my favorite directors. On a similar note, What are your favourite books, both fiction and non-fiction? Honestly, that is just impossible to answer. I have so many favourite books. I thought of answering with my favourite authors, but unfortunately I have so many of them too. What are your thoughts on the movie A Knight's Tale? I haven't seen it, and I really don't know anything about it, so I don't have an opinion. As an anarchist, do you have any positions on the organisation of healthcare systems? I believe universal public healthcare is a fundamental human right. In both Taiwan and Australia, I've benefited from two of the best modern public healthcare systems. For example, in Taiwan, I had a surgery involving 2 nights in hospital and paid only $90, including meals. Thank you so much for your questions, and in particular, thank you so much for your support. If you haven't already, please feel free to join my Discord server. See the link in the video description. It's quite active with over 200 members, and you'll find me commenting there on a semi-regular basis.